So hello fellow Earthlings, this is Earthling 6455463728, and people really need to stop with the old cliche about how government agencies are so inefficient compared to the private sector. I mean, I think for the most part that people don't know what they're talking about when they say stuff like that. For example, I didn't know in one instance that the public sector, and this is something that I adopted into my own life. In the public sector, while I was working with the government, I realized that, at least the department where I was working, they always got 3 quotes before they decided to choose which one amongst those they were going to get. They never just went out and, called up a place and bought something. They had to keep documentation of that for the most part. I mean, every once in a while, I don't know under what circumstances it was, but my boss would say, hey, let's buy from this particular place. I guess that he was trying to make sure, well, to give them a helping hand or something like that. But by and large, most of the time, you had to get those 3 quotes. And one of the things that I realized when I started to do that is that I can actually save money. Before I used to do that, before I worked with the government and saw them doing that, and a lot of times I didn't used to get quotes. I would just, talk to somebody, they would give me a price, and I would decide if I'm going to get that thing or not because of the price. I wouldn't call around to see if one place was cheaper or not. Now, I had to get something signed by a notary republic recently, and I thought that this particular place was close to me, so let me call them up and find out what the price is. So I called them up, and then I said, well, I'm still supposed to call this other place. So I called this other place, and then I thought, 3, let's get 3. So I called the other place, and wouldn't you know it, the place that I finally decided to go was half of the price of the first place that I called, and it was better situated for me to do other things at the same time. If I had never worked for the government, I would never have developed that habit of doing that sort of thing. And I can't even think of how much more money I would have wasted in different respects because I didn't do that sort of thing. And I guess in a lot of other instances as well, I might not specifically get 3 quotes, but I might try to figure out how to get a lot of quotes, I guess, and then ask questions and figure out how to get things done, sometimes at no cost, just by thinking outside of the box, for example. And one of the things that I guess the average person doesn't realize is that, for example, you can actually get a degree in public policy, for example. I have a friend of mine who went to Harvard University and got a degree in public policy. And there are, different types of procurement, for example. That whole thing with the 3 quotes, that is part of how you do procurement. You can study and learn how to do that. So I think a lot of people have this perception that the private sector is cutting edge. They're always doing new things. And in some instances, yeah, that's true. That is something that can happen. In other instances, no, they're not. In other instances, they can be really, really wasteful. You have a lot of people out there starting businesses, and they would not have done any, groundwork. You're supposed to do for example, a SWOT analysis. Your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. That's something that I learned from my master's in business, and I suppose a lot of people in the private sector might have a degree in business of some sort. And yeah, they can use things like that in the private sector, but you can also use that in the public sector. And one of the things that the public sector is about is making sure that it can exist tomorrow. Now, don't get me wrong, lots of different public sectors, they do really stupid things. You know, people borrow from pension funds in private and public sectors. But one of the things about the public sector is that regardless of a recession or basically however bad things get, people look to the government. They don't look to Amazon. They don't look to Apple. They don't look to any private sector company. And rightly so, because let's say the US as a country, let's say the UK as a country, let's say France, let's say Russia, China. A lot of these places have not been continuous entities for hundreds of years. And yet, a lot of them have been. They have stood the test of time in terms of being around for a couple hundred years or so in a particular form. And that's a difficult thing to expect from a company. And furthermore, people expect one thing from a company. From Apple, for the most, well, not one thing. I mean, there's a narrow band, a range of things that you expect from a company. You know, so let's say from Coca-Cola, you expect Coca-Cola. Let's say from KFC, you expect KFC. People expect everything from the government in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, there are different layers of government. There's, you know, the police, for example, as a part of an extension of the government. There's the legal system. There's the school system. There's the legislature. People expect a lot from this entity that we call the government, whereas they don't really expect too much from a company. Honestly, after any given recession, you know, a company might go belly up, it might go bankrupt. That it happens. But people are not expecting that the government is going to fold. If anything really horrible happens, people are always like crying like for their mama. Where is the government? Why didn't the county do this? Why didn't the government do that? Why didn't the president or the premier or the prime minister, why didn't they do this? People, on one hand, they diss the government for being so ineffective and for being so wasteful. And these are things that they don't really know much about in terms of how these things actually, how the government actually functions. Now, don't get me wrong, 100% there are problems and mistakes in the way that the government works. But if you pay attention to companies, there are lots of companies that spend, in the news, for example, that might spend $1 billion on this purchase, $100 million on this other purchase. You remember when AOL bought Time Warner? Was that it? AOL was able to buy Time Warner, I think, some crazy thing like that. And basically it was because of its overly inflated bubble price that it had the money to do that. And then AOL is what now? I mean, I think if the dot-com bubble was in 2000 or so, and now we're in 2020, AOL was exciting and it was whatever. And now we all know that it's useless. You know, I don't even know why the name AOL even still exists. Do they still provide CDs and stuff for people to use dial-up? The private sector makes huge mistakes lots of the time. But people don't seem to remember it when they keep bringing up this cliche about how wasteful the government is and how useless it is and nobody can do anything. I don't even know what people really think about when they talk about the private sector being so efficient. The reason why the private sector is supposed to be efficient as a sector, not as a company, as a sector, is because companies fail. The ones that are weak fail, and the ones that are strong succeed. And we're supposed to get, well, supposedly, and we're supposed to get the most successful companies from that. Nobody really wants, to have a whole bunch of, like, let's say, fire departments. We don't want to have a whole bunch of fire departments and pit them against each other. And the fire departments that actually, put out fires, they succeed. And the ones that don't, they fail. We just want a good fire department that does what it's supposed to, put out fires. We don't want people to have to experiment and see, oh yeah, well, this is a better fire department, next time when my house is burning down, I'll call them. Really? That is ridiculous. Another thing too is, if the government is so horrible, how come it has to bail out private sector companies that are failing? Or not even, like in America, the government had to bail out all those car companies for all those people's jobs and so on. Really? This was a horrible, inefficient government. Do you really want them bailing out anybody? Find somebody else to bail out those places. And yet there's no one. Everybody, it's like kids with their parents, right? Like, oh, my parents suck, they're horrible, whatever, da. And then when you're in trouble, who do you call? The same parents who suck and da. I think that people really need to take a harder look. This whole thing reminds me of the whole idea of, all right, if you boil a frog and you increase the temperature a little bit at a time, eventually the frog is going to get boiled alive. I think I would have said that a number of times, and I read somewhere that doesn't make any sense, and I've been telling people because it doesn't make any sense. You know what that's like saying? It's like saying that a lizard that goes out in the sun to warm itself up, they just stay there because it gradually increases the temperature until they die. How many dead lizards do you see sitting out in the sun because they didn't know that they were getting too warm? That doesn't make any sense. Or if you're in a hot tub or something, you're gonna stay there until you die, because how many frogs have you seen that happened to? What are people talking about anyway? But anyway, guys, that's my normal rant. So you can wish me luck. So you can like, unlike, comment, subscribe, and/or share. Peace. Of course, you can do nothing.